This continent is home to some of the most breathtaking landscapes on Earth, from expansive coastlines to towering alpine peaks and vast deserts. These lands were not just geographical features. For thousands of years, they were sacred homelands to hundreds, even thousands of native tribes. To these tribes, the land was not simply a resource. It was a living, breathing entity, deeply connected to their culture, identity, and spirituality. Then, everything changed. In the spring of 1803, two American politicians in Paris finalized what they believed was the deal of a century. For just $15 million, the United States acquired a vast expanse of territory known as the Louisiana Purchase. Overnight, the nation nearly doubled in size, a transaction celebrated as a monumental achievement in diplomacy and a cornerstone for American expansion. But there was a catch. France didn't actually own the land it sold. What the United States bought were imperial rights to expand westward without interference from European powers. The real owners of the land were the native tribes who had lived there for countless generations. To claim the territory, the United States would have to confront these tribes, who held profound ties to their ancestral lands. At first, the U.S. government promised a different approach. They claimed they would not act like the colonial empires they had broken free from. Leaders like George Washington pledged to establish relationships based on fairness and justice with native tribes. Treaties were presented as a means of securing land without conflict, with promises of fair compensation. These agreements often offered goods like farming equipment, cash, and the services of blacksmiths to help the tribes transition. But the reality quickly diverged from these promises. Many native tribes refused to part with their ancestral lands, understanding that their connection to these territories went far beyond economic value. The land was sacred, woven into their culture, history, and spirituality. No amount of farming tools or cash could replace what the land meant to them. When diplomacy failed, the U.S. turned to deceit and brute force. One striking example occurred near the Great Lakes, where native tribes drew a firm boundary and warned the United States to respect their lands. Initially, the tribes succeeded in defending their territories, defeating U.S. forces in two separate conflicts. However, the U.S. returned stronger, and after a third attempt, they forced the tribes to cede control of the area, which now forms the state of Ohio. As the United States expanded its ambitions, its methods grew increasingly underhanded. Manipulative tactics became commonplace. Tribal leaders were often plied with alcohol during negotiations, impairing their ability to make informed decisions. In some cases, unauthorized individuals were appointed as representatives of tribes and signed away land without true consent. Even when treaties were agreed upon, they were frequently ignored. A glaring example of this occurred when gold was discovered on lands guaranteed to the Sioux and Arapaho tribes. These agreements were quickly discarded, and settlers, lured by the promise of wealth, poured into the territories. Backed by military roads and government maps, the invasion of these lands was swift and overwhelming. Over nearly a century, the U.S. government signed 368 treaties with native tribes. These treaties often acted as a facade, giving an illusion of fairness, while serving as tools of imperial conquest. Behind the carefully drafted language lay a relentless drive to seize land, displace its rightful inhabitants, and expand the United States at any cost. The defining moment in the systematic displacement of native tribes came in 1830 with the passage of the Indian Removal Act. Championed by President Andrew Jackson, this law authorized the forced relocation of native tribes from their ancestral lands to regions deemed uninhabitable in the Great Plains. Using taxpayer money to fund the initiative, the government promised that these new lands would remain untouched by settlers and that the tribes would be left alone there forever. Andrew Jackson defended the policy by claiming the relocations would be voluntary, peaceful, and conducted with respect for pre-existing treaties. However, in practice, it was a carefully orchestrated campaign of deception and violence. Threats, bribes, and military force became the tools of implementation. The government primarily targeted the 5 civilized tribes: the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Muskogee, and Seminole. These tribes had already integrated many aspects of European culture, adopting practices such as English language use, farming, and even owning slaves. Despite their efforts to coexist with the settlers, they were forced off their lands to make way for the booming cotton plantations of the South. Between 1831 and 1838, the Indian Removal Act resulted in the displacement of over 100,000 native people. Their forced migration, often on foot, spanned more than 1,000 miles through unforgiving weather and treacherous terrain. This journey came to be known as the Trail of Tears, a name that evokes the immense suffering endured along the way. Thousands died from starvation, disease, and exposure, leaving a legacy of heartbreak and loss that would resonate for generations. The campaign of displacement and destruction carried out against native tribes was not merely a historical event. It left a profound and lasting legacy that echoes across time. Far from being an isolated chapter in American history, it became a blueprint for acts of ethnic cleansing in other parts of the world. Adolf Hitler himself drew inspiration from this process when planning his invasion of Russia during World War II. He referenced the systematic displacement of Native Americans and called the Volga River our Mississippi, a chilling acknowledgement of how this dark history influenced his own genocidal ambitions. What makes this legacy even more haunting is how meticulously it was documented. Every action, whether it was the signing of treaties, the allocation of payments, or the issuance of military orders, was recorded in painstaking detail, creating an undeniable paper trail of conquest. It wasn't chaotic or improvised. It was a calculated operation, supported by laws, regulations, and the full weight of governmental bureaucracy. This tragedy serves as a stark reminder of the devastating consequences of imperial ambition and the weaponization of legal and administrative systems against marginalized groups. The scars of this calculated displacement remain visible, not just in history books, but in the generational trauma of the descendants of those who were forcibly removed from their homelands. When the tribes were forcibly relocated to Indian territory, they encountered a harsh and unfamiliar land. The challenges they faced were immense: scarce resources, hostile environments, and continued pressure from settlers who viewed their new lands as ripe for expansion. Yet, despite these adversities, the tribes demonstrated extraordinary resilience and determination. Rather than surrendering completely, many tribes turned to legal frameworks and policies, the very systems that had displaced them, to defend their remaining rights and land. Through petitions, court battles, and advocacy, they sought to secure their remaining rights and protect what little land and autonomy they had left. These efforts laid the groundwork for future battles for sovereignty and self-determination. This struggle for dignity and justice was not just about survival. It was about preserving their identity, culture, and the hope for a better future. The resilience of these tribes in the face of oppression speaks to their enduring spirit and the unbreakable bond they share with their heritage. Stay tuned for Part 2, where we will explore how these tribes rebuilt their communities, forged new paths of resistance, and continued to fight against further oppression. Their story is one of survival, resilience, and the unyielding pursuit of sovereignty.